The final call Jaleayah Davis ever made was a desperate, panicked plea to her sister for a ride. She was crying, terrified, and trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. Just minutes later, her body was discovered on the cold asphalt of Interstate 77. Authorities were quick to label it a tragic, single-car accident. But from the very beginning, the evidence screamed a different story. A car found running with its doors locked, and friends whose accounts of the night kept changing. This is the story of a family's fight for justice against an official narrative that never added up. They don't believe Jaleayah crashed her car. They believe what happened on that dark highway was far more sinister, and that the truth was buried before the sun came up. The time was approaching 3:30 a.m. when Talby's phone rang again. The caller ID showed her sister, Jaleayah Davis. 2 earlier calls that night had already raised concerns. Jaleayah had sounded irritated, even anxious, but this third call was something else entirely. She was crying, panicked, saying she couldn't stay where she was. Her voice cracked with desperation as she begged Talby to come get her immediately. In the background, a voice, later identified as her friend Kristen, was arguing with her over a set of car keys. Jaleayah was demanding them back, repeating herself over and over. Talby could tell the situation was spiraling. She promised she'd leave right away. The original plan was to pick her up at a gas station at the intersection of Rosemar Road and Emerson Avenue. But minutes later, Jaleayah called again, now crying harder, changing the meeting spot. She wanted to be picked up at the rest area by mile marker 181 on I-77. She didn't explain why. She only kept saying she'd tell Talby everything in person. At 3:36 a.m., Jaleayah tried calling one last time, but this time, Talby missed the call. That was the final attempt Jaleayah made to reach her sister. Just a few minutes later, emergency services began receiving reports from passing drivers. A car was parked on the side of the road, and something was in the road. For Talby, that early morning became a living nightmare, one she's had to recount many times since. She knew her sister had needed her. She knew something wasn't right, and those final calls became the heart of a mystery that still haunts everyone who hears it. At 3:41 a.m., the first 911 call came in. A driver had spotted the vehicle on the shoulder of I-77, right up against the guardrail. No one seemed to be around. Another call followed shortly after. This time, a driver who had pulled over decided to take a closer look. While on the phone with the dispatcher, he began walking alongside the road, checking the area. At first, he hoped he was mistaken. But as he got closer, it became tragically clear. There was a person lying in the road. At 3:48 a.m., the caller confirmed over the phone that he had located a body, and added in a shaken voice that parts of it appeared to be scattered nearby. He described how cars continued to pass dangerously close and pleaded for law enforcement to arrive immediately. Just then, a tanker truck pulled over and blocked part of the road with its headlights, trying to prevent further harm. Moments later, the witness told the dispatcher he could see clothing on the highway along with signs of blood. The body, he said, was in a condition that made identification nearly impossible. By 3:52 a.m., a third call came in. Another driver reported seeing what looked like blood and remains near mile marker 182. He mentioned a small passenger car near the guardrail. At first, he assumed it was a case of an animal being struck, but clarified that several vehicles had stopped and were keeping others from getting too close. The first patrol units arrived shortly after. What they found was disturbing. There were large amounts of blood and biological matter spread across the pavement. A woman's body was located several yards from the guardrail. The head had been separated from the torso. The skull was fractured. Much of the face was missing. Along the guardrail, blood and tissue stretched for nearly 90 feet, consistent with repeated impact against the metal posts. The upper part of her clothing was missing. A torn bra was found, with the hook still intact, but the fabric split beneath the arm. There were bloodstains on the tank top and undershirt. Her jacket had damage near where the hood had been ripped off, with frayed fabric around the tier. The right sleeve was damaged, the left was not. These items were found resting on the guardrail in a way that raised suspicions. They appeared to have been placed in an orderly line, not scattered by force. The body showed signs of severe trauma. The right leg was broken below the knee. The jeans had large tears on the inner thigh, from the knee to the ankle along the front, and another on the back of the right thigh. The skin of the chest was torn, and the right side of the chest was missing tissue. Her arms were positioned above her head in a way consistent with pulling a shirt off over the head. Jaleayah Davis's vehicle was found about 2/10 of a mile away. Jaleayah Davis was born on March 19, 1992 in Marietta, Ohio. Her family, Mother Kim, Father Jamie, and Sister Talby, lived in a tight-knit community where word traveled fast and help was rarely asked for. Because it was already on the way, Jaleayah kept in constant touch with home, regularly texting and calling her loved ones. She shared her plans and whereabouts often and didn't go silent for long. Talby, her sister, was the one she messaged most, and they had an unspoken rule: always answer, especially at night. Jaleayah's everyday world stretched between Marietta and Parkersburg, West Virginia, a corridor known locally as the Mid-Ohio Valley. The bridge across the river made crossing state lines effortless, so for most of the young people in the area, the state border was little more than a technicality. Jaleayah often drove across that bridge, handling errands and meetups by day and by night, heading to bars, pool halls, or friends' apartments. Parkersburg had the nightlife. Marietta had home. Jaleayah Davis was known for her outgoing, vibrant personality. She could easily strike up conversations and quickly connect with new people, but when it came to trust, her circle was small. Mostly family and one or two close friends she felt comfortable spending the evening with. She was cautious when stepping into new social scenes. While she could hold a conversation, Jaleayah preferred to know ahead of time who would be there and how the trip there and back was planned. In her texts to family, she made a habit of noting important details, addresses, names of places, and either full names or nicknames of the people her friends were hanging out with. This became a routine, tracking the night step by step so she could always retrace where she had been. Kristen Bechtold entered Jaleayah's life only a few months before the events in question. Their friendship developed quickly and they began hanging out regularly, but their relationship was unpredictable. They'd easily make plans and just as easily argue over small things, then reconnect again. When it came to nights out, Kristen was the one setting the tone, deciding who to meet, where to go, and what was happening in Parkersburg. Kristen was connected to a small group of young people who often gathered at a house in Parkersburg owned by Brian Sapp. That house served as a kind of home base for the group. They'd meet there before going out and usually return there afterward. Jaleayah didn't know Brian personally. His house meant little to her beyond being a gathering point. Somewhere she ended up because of her connection with Kristen. Freddie Scott was one of Kristen's close contacts and often played the role of driver for the group. He was usually behind the wheel, taking the crew wherever the evening led, whether to a bar, a friend's place, or back to Brian's. His involvement seemed like a natural extension of Kristen's relationships. For Jaleayah, though, Freddie was someone new. They hadn't interacted before that night, and any communication between them was limited to the group setting. Katie Nelson was also part of that circle, though she joined the evening later after the group had already started moving around town. She had her own backstory, one that would soon become important. Jordan Campbell was another name in the mix, connected to both Kristen and Freddie. He was there as part of the night's events, riding along and tagging along, but he didn't play a central role in what would unfold. For Jaleayah, he was just another unfamiliar face that night. In the end, Jaleayah's presence in this group made sense. Her friendship with Kristen brought her into a crew where Brian's house was the meeting spot. Freddie drove, Katie came in midway, and Jordan was part of the extended circle. For Jaleayah, nearly everyone in the group was new. Kristen was her only real link, the one person tying it all together. It was Friday, November 18, 2011. Around 5 p.m., Jaleayah left Marietta in her car and drove to Kristen Bechtold's place. The plan? To get ready and pregame. At this stage of the night, they were still at Kristen's, doing makeup, changing clothes, and mapping out their plans for Parkersburg. By 9:30 p.m., Jaleayah Davis and Kristen Bechtold arrived at Brian Sapp's house in Parkersburg. A small group was already forming, mostly friends of Kristen's, gathering for what looked like the beginning of a night out. Shortly after 10 p.m., Freddie Scott joined them. The first signs of drinking started here. The girls continued the pregame they had begun earlier at Kristen's, and the group had a few drinks at Brian's place for a limited time. Around 10:30 p.m., Jaleayah, Kristen, and Freddie headed out to pick up Katie Nelson. The meeting spot was the Hardee's restaurant on 7th Street. After picking her up, the group returned once again to Brian's house. Back at the house, the group spent some more time together. The relaxed drinking continued, and another name began to circulate: Jordan. At this point in the night, there were no signs of any significant tension. The logistics were straightforward: gather at Brian's, pick up Katie, return, and plan the next move. Transportation was handled within the group, and from early on it had been decided that Jaleayah would not be driving for the remainder of the night. Who would take the wheel and where they'd head next would be decided later. Around midnight, the group left Brian's and made their way to a local bar in Parkersburg called Nip and Q. Freddie was driving. Passengers included Jaleayah Davis, Kristen Bechtold, Katie Nelson, and Jordan. Jaleayah had left her own vehicle at Brian's, so from that point forward, the group's movement relied on Freddie. Inside the bar, the vibe shifted quickly to lively. Tables were full, music was playing, people were playing pool, and the bar was serving drinks steadily. The group blended in and began ordering alcohol almost immediately. By then, Jaleayah was showing clear signs of being heavily intoxicated. Kristen would later claim that Jaleayah had taken around 16 shots throughout the evening, though the exact amount is impossible to verify. One person who would become central to this part of the evening was Chris Latimer, Katie Nelson's ex-boyfriend. He was also at Nip and Q that night. Katie and Chris had a past, and their breakup had left behind some tension. His presence immediately changed the group dynamic. Jaleayah ended up spending a lot of time with Chris. They talked, they danced, and to outside observers, it looked like a casual, friendly connection. But to Katie, the situation felt very different. Witnesses later noted that Jaleayah stayed close to Chris for much of the night, which clearly upset Katie. There was no direct confrontation in the bar, but passive tension was present. Glances, subtle comments, and a shift in the group's mood. Kristen would later acknowledge that the dynamic between her friend and Katie's ex created friction, even if it didn't escalate into a scene. Aside from that, the group acted like any other cluster of late-night bar patrons, ordering more drinks, moving between tables, and socializing. By 3 a.m., the bar was closing and the group began gathering to leave. It was noted that by this time, the mood within the group had grown more strained. Freddie once again took the driver's seat, and the others piled into the car to head back to Brian's. The unresolved tension between Katie and Jaleayah, centered around Chris Latimer, remained unspoken, but it lingered, riding along with them into the rest of the night. The visit to the bar had clearly become a turning point in the evening. What began as a fun night had shifted. Alcohol was flowing freely, and tensions within the group were starting to show. Personal dynamics that had once felt manageable were now simmering just beneath the surface. Sometime after 3 a.m., the group returned to Brian Sapp's house. Jaleayah Davis's car was still parked there from earlier in the night, so they pulled up along the curb without going inside. That's where it happened, inside Freddie's car, a disagreement that quickly escalated into a heated argument. Jaleayah was demanding the return of her car keys and a small wristlet, where she typically kept her ID and other essentials. According to those present, the search for her keys took place in the cramped back seat. People checked the floor mats, underneath the seats, jacket pockets, and bags. Kristen said she was actively looking and guessed the keys might have slipped under a seat. Katie suggested setting the issue aside and continuing the night, while Jordan stayed quiet, not getting involved. Freddie remained behind the wheel. The inside of the car was a mess, bags and jackets from the bar scattered around, and the tight space only made the tension worse. Jaleayah was insistent. She didn't want to wait. Her car was right there, and she wasn't willing to leave without getting her keys back. She wanted a clear resolution. Either return the keys now or take her somewhere she could meet someone to pick her up. Kristen later claimed the wristlet was eventually found in the car, and she handed it over to Jaleayah, but the keys weren't inside. The argument intensified. Jaleayah was growing more frustrated. Without her keys, she had no control over her car, no way to leave on her own terms. She kept opening the door as if to leave, then sitting back down, repeating her demand to get the keys. Time was running out. The bar had closed, and the group still hadn't decided whether to drop everyone off or take Jaleayah to a meetup spot she had mentioned. Her requests and the suggestions from Kristen and Katie clashed, neither side willing to budge. Eventually, the keys were found and handed back to her. In the aftermath, the only sources for what happened next were the people who had spent those final hours with Jaleayah Davis. Their statements formed the foundation of the initial story, that Jaleayah had been dropped off alone near her car outside Brian's house. But from the very beginning, investigators noticed inconsistencies, not just in small details, but in major parts of the timeline. Kristen claimed that around 3:40 a.m. they pulled up next to Jaleayah's car and left her there, saying she was waiting for her sister to arrive. Kristen said the argument over the keys had been resolved by then. She also emphasized that Jaleayah had been heavily intoxicated, but according to her, there was no intention of Jaleayah trying to drive. Freddie Scott shared a different version of events. According to him, the group had dropped Jaleayah off near her car and then he drove the others home. But his account had inconsistencies. At one point, he claimed he saw her get into her vehicle, then later admitted she might have stayed outside. He also mentioned a brief argument Jaleayah supposedly had with an unknown man near the bar, although no other witness backed up that claim. Katie Nelson, in her written statement, generally supported what Kristen and Freddie had said, that Jaleayah was left near her vehicle and the group parted ways. However, she also admitted to hearing the argument inside Freddie's car, where Jaleayah was asking for her keys to be returned. But when these accounts were compared to the actual calls Jaleayah made that night, the discrepancies became clear. At 3:28 a.m. and again at 3:33 a.m., she called her sister Talby, pleading with her to come pick her up. In both calls, Kristen's voice could be heard in the background. During these conversations, Jaleayah clearly insisted she should have her keys and was asking for someone to find and return them to her. This contradicted the group's statements that she had already been calmly waiting by her car. The evidence showed that during her final calls, she was still with the group and still fighting to get her keys back. When investigators examined Jaleayah Davis's vehicle, several things stood out that didn't align with a typical car crash scenario. The engine was still running, the keys were in the ignition, the gear shift was in drive, both the headlights and interior lights were on. This all suggested that the car had not been turned off manually and likely came to a stop for reasons beyond the driver's control. The doors were locked. That raised more questions, because this make and model was designed to unlock automatically if the airbags deployed. That didn't happen. Investigators didn't rule out the possibility that someone manually locked the doors after the car had already come to a stop. There was no blood found inside the cabin except for a small amount on the gear shift. Forensic testing showed that this blood came from more than one source. Jaleayah's DNA was present, But there was a second profile as well. The car's exterior had only moderate damage. The front right side showed dents and long scrapes that lined up with guardrail contact. But the extent of the damage didn't match a scenario where a driver had been ejected at high speed. In fact, the passenger side window had been pushed inward, not outward, contradicting the theory that someone was thrown through the glass from inside. Investigators paid special attention to the underside of the car. They found a significant amount of blood and biological material beneath the chassis, especially near the headlights and grille. Traces were even found inside the grille and on the suspension components. Blood was also found on the driver's side door handle, suggesting the body had made contact with the vehicle after the crash, or that someone with bloodied hands had touched the handle. The tire marks on the pavement didn't support the theory of a sudden loss of control. Just past the point of impact with the guardrail, investigators noted thin black streaks that looked more like brief acceleration than hard braking. It almost appeared as though the car had continued moving for a short distance after the initial collision, then simply rolled forward on its own. On the passenger seat, Jaleayah's purse was found intact. Inside the center console, investigators noticed something odd, a CD halfway ejected from the player. It was marked as unusual, but no clear explanation was given for it. Taken together, the scene didn't resemble a standard traffic accident. The locked doors, engine still running, relatively limited exterior damage, blood and biological material underneath the vehicle, and the neatly placed clothing on the guardrail, all of it fueled the doubts of Jaleayah Davis's family and some outside experts. To them, it didn't seem likely that her passing could be explained by a simple loss of control due to alcohol. The official medical examiner's report stated that Jaleayah died as a result of multiple blunt force injuries consistent with high-impact trauma typical of a motor vehicle incident. The findings described severe damage to the head and torso, injuries deemed incompatible with survival. The manner of death was ruled an accident. Toxicology results showed no presence of any prohibited substances. However, her blood alcohol level was above the legal limit. The report noted that due to the way alcohol metabolizes, her blood alcohol concentration could have continued to rise shortly after her last drink had she remained alive. No other intoxicants or medications that might impair behavior or coordination were detected. Her clothing and biological samples were sent for additional lab testing. No traces of automotive paint were found on her skin or clothing. There were also no particles of airbag propellant powder found on her outerwear or in her hair. Investigators used standard external and internal examination techniques, including photographic documentation, and matched those findings to diagrams of the crash scene. The official reconstruction accepted by law enforcement and included in the final report went as follows. Jaleayah Davis was allegedly driving without a seatbelt on Interstate 77. At some point, she became distracted, possibly leaning over toward the passenger seat to reach for a dropped phone. The car veered right and scraped against the guardrail. During this phase, investigators theorized that she may have been partially pushed through the passenger side window, upper body outside, lower body still inside. Her head then made repeated contact with the support posts of the guardrail until the rest of her body exited the vehicle. The car, still moving, continued down the road until it eventually coasted to a stop against the barrier. Police explained the absence of a front passenger during the impact by pointing to the fact that the passenger side airbag hadn't deployed and there were no obvious signs inside the vehicle indicating someone else had been there. Following that logic, they also proposed that Jaleayah's upper clothing came off during the violent motion of being ejected and hitting surrounding structures. The items were found scattered across the guardrail at varying distances, supposedly having come off in stages. Another part of the official narrative focused on the condition of her body. Investigators stated that after the initial crash, heavy vehicles continued traveling through the area and that 2 large trucks ran over the remains before traffic was fully stopped. This detail was cited as a possible explanation for the extent of injuries documented during the autopsy. According to both the forensic report and the official case findings, her death was attributed to a traffic incident. Investigators found no basis for any criminal charges. The case was classified as an accidental death and subsequently closed. But once investigators issued their final report claiming that Jaleayah Davis had died in a solo vehicle accident, her family and several people close to her began pointing out details that simply didn't align with that conclusion. The more closely the case was examined, the more it started to look less like a routine crash and more like a sequence of strange and unexplained events. One of the first things that stood out was the interior of the vehicle. Given the severity of her injuries, the inside of the car was surprisingly clean. There were no visible signs of blood, no strands of hair, no torn fabric, nothing to suggest someone had been violently thrown through a window. In cases of ejection, it's typical to find visible biological traces, blood splatter, fabric fibers, skin contact marks. But in this case, the cabin remained untouched. That directly challenged the claim that Jaleayah had been thrown out through the passenger window. Her clothing also raised serious questions. Her bra, shirt, and jacket were found draped along the guardrail in near-perfect order, one item laid on top of the other, as if someone had placed them there deliberately. In a real accident, clothing is torn off in uneven patterns and lands chaotically, not laid out like a display. The airbags presented another issue. The driver's side airbag had deployed, but the passenger side one had not. Investigators used that to suggest that Jaleayah was the only person in the vehicle. But later it was revealed that the airbag sensor system on the passenger side had been malfunctioning for some time. Meaning, even if someone had been sitting next to her, the airbag might not have gone off. That undermined one of the key points used in the official version. Then there were the locked doors. This specific model was designed so that the doors should automatically unlock when airbags deploy to help emergency responders get inside. But when the vehicle was discovered, all the doors were locked and the engine was still running. That suggested someone had exited the car and locked it manually after everything had already happened. One more troubling detail: the car's key fob was later found in the possession of Kristen, the last friend known to have seen Jaleayah alive. Kristen's explanations about how she ended up with the key changed multiple times. At one point, she claimed Jaleayah had left it at her house. Later, she said she found it by accident. Neither version fully added up. Experts also examined the tire tracks left at the scene. The marks indicated that the car had first stopped near the guardrail, then accelerated again. But by that point, Jaleayah was already deceased and couldn't have been driving. That meant someone else must have been behind the wheel during those final moments. One particularly noteworthy detail: early that morning, police attempted to question Kristen first. She wasn't at home. In the driveway, there were two cars, one coated in heavy frost, the other almost completely clear, suggesting it had been used recently. According to the group's timeline, Kristen was supposed to have returned home with Freddie and hadn't gone anywhere afterward. Kristen hired an attorney almost immediately and refused to speak with investigators. To some, this looked like a red flag. To others, it was just smart legal caution. Freddie, whose father was a retired police officer, behaved with arrogance and disrespect. On social media, he made jokes about what happened, mocked Jaleayah's grieving family, and even messaged people offering to tell the truth in exchange for expensive gifts. A photo eventually surfaced showing his hand wrapped in bandages, sparking rumors that he had injured it that night, possibly during an encounter involving Jaleayah's vehicle. Katie, the daughter of a law enforcement officer, gave an official statement. She said that after the bar closed, they all drove to Brian's house and later got into Freddie's car. According to her, Jaleayah and Kristen got into an argument over the car keys during that time. Katie claimed she saw Jaleayah walk back toward her vehicle, after which the group drove off. Another troubling moment came when Kristen showed up at the restaurant where Jaleayah's mother worked just days after the funeral. She came with her family, creating a visibly tense situation. The manager, sensing things could escalate, ended up calling the police. The behavior of the group after Jaleayah's death raised even more suspicion: refusal to cooperate, nervous phone calls, withholding information, and social media posts that many saw as insensitive. Rather than support the investigation or offer any comfort to the family, they gave the impression that there was something to hide. Jaleayah Davis's loved ones had expected a thorough and unbiased investigation. What they got felt very different. From the earliest days, it became clear that the police weren't treating the case with urgency. Detective Camille Waldron was assigned to lead the investigation, but she never visited the crash site herself, relying solely on traffic collision reports and second-hand information. In her documentation, she repeatedly described Jaleayah as being extremely intoxicated, a detail that, while true based on toxicology, was noted in a way that seemed to frame the narrative. To Jaleayah's family, it felt like the detective was shaping her as the drunk victim, shutting the door on any deeper investigation before it could begin. The evidence collection in Jaleayah Davis's case was remarkably superficial. Investigators never fully processed the car for fingerprints, and biological traces were only partially analyzed. A second DNA profile found on the gearshift was never matched to anyone. Critical items found at the scene, articles of clothing, a hood, even an earring, were left lying on the roadside instead of being collected as evidence. The car was left exposed to the elements for days, and only after repeated requests from the family was it partially covered. When Jaleayah's father visited the crash site himself to take photographs, the lead detective warned him he could be charged with tampering with evidence. For the family, that moment solidified a growing belief. The police seemed more concerned with protecting reputations than uncovering the truth. Further suspicions were fueled by the circle of acquaintances Jaleayah spent her final night with. Many had close ties to law enforcement, children of officers, relatives of a former sheriff. This raised concerns that investigators might be holding back to avoid implicating anyone from influential families. Despite repeated efforts by Jaleayah's family to have the case reopened, they received only form letter responses. Even in 2019, when independent investigators used luminol on the vehicle and discovered new traces of blood under the car, authorities refused to revisit the case. Ultimately, the official explanation that the crash was simply an accident caused by Jaleayah Davis herself was locked in without fully considering the broader evidence. For her family, it wasn't just a personal tragedy. It became an example of how investigative shortcuts and bias can erase hope for justice. In the days and weeks after Jaleayah's death, the behavior of her friends only deepened the family's concerns. Rumors soon began circulating that Kristen and her group were trying to coordinate their stories. Text messages surfaced in which someone asked others not to say anything to the police. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Kristen and Freddie together early that morning, Kristen reportedly in distress and Freddie with a bandaged hand. Their behavior after the tragedy created a troubling pattern. Rather than show grief or cooperate, they appeared anxious, evasive, and even made sarcastic remarks online. There are several theories about what really happened to Jaleayah Davis that night. The official version, according to law enforcement, Jaleayah, heavily intoxicated, got behind the wheel, lost control, hit the guardrail, and was ejected through the passenger side window. Her injuries, they say, were the result of being struck by passing trucks. Her mother's version: she firmly believes her daughter couldn't have driven in that state. She believes Jaleayah was pinned against the guardrail with her own car and her body was dragged beneath it. That would explain why blood and tissue were found under the vehicle, not inside it. Other alternative theories include Kristen may have been the one driving, and a fight inside the car led to the crash. An altercation could have happened inside the car, possibly involving a broken window, and Jaleayah may have been pushed or thrown out. Some believe that after the incident, those involved may have actively hidden details, using connections within local law enforcement to keep the case from going deeper. None of these alternative theories have been confirmed officially, but it's the inconsistencies in the evidence that continue to cast doubt on the sole accepted version. In search of answers, the family turned to independent experts. Private investigators examined the car and concluded that the marks beneath it didn't match the scenario of someone being thrown through a window. To Jaleayah's mother and sister, the car became more than just a piece of evidence. It became the last silent witness to what happened that night. They returned to it time and again, hoping it would help them reconstruct the truth. But the way authorities allowed potential evidence to be compromised only deepened their mistrust in the investigation. Thanks for listening to Beyond the Crime. If this episode resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who should hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes.